KPMG presents The Blueprint, Business in the New Normal.
Hello and a very warm welcome to KPMG Presents The Blueprint Business in the New Normal in association with CNBC-TV18. In a world where progress is key, the harmony between growth and sustainability becomes vital. The concept of growing with less emphasizes the need for balanced progress that doesn't come at the cost of our environment. It's about doing more with less, using resources efficiently, and leaving a lighter footprint. This approach ensures we thrive without compromising the world we live in. It's a journey towards a future where growth and the well being of our planet walk hand in hand. And to discuss this further, I have with me Anish Day, Global Head of Energy and Natural Resources, KPMG, and Apurba Mitra, Partner-ESG, KPMG in India. Anish, let me begin by asking you, how can we balance growth and sustainability, and what's really at stake here?
So it's a difficult balance because you see the growth, unfortunately, is hungry for resources, and also in today's world, there is an automatic linkage to emissions, and the world has reached almost its limits in terms of the emissions budgets, at least for 1.5 degree warming. So, as a consequence, this will be a challenge, but we must find a way around. And there are levers which I'll talk about, which we have to use for doing that. But as of now, it is a difficult challenge, but it is something which we have to deal with because there are very large swaths of population in emerging Asia and Africa which really are not at the levels of human well-being that you wish or if you want. In fact, it doesn't meet a lot of the UN sustainability goals. So to that extent, we have to find the ways around that.
All right, let me go across to you, Apurva. Could we break down the growth and sustainability paradox here?
Sustainability in my lexicon isn't bereft of growth, especially for a country like India, because if you don't grow as an economy, how do we sustain our growing populations, right? Or how do we pull millions out of poverty? As a business, how do you sustain your competitive advantage? So for me, growth is an essential part of sustainability. So the larger challenge in my mind essentially is how do you achieve sustainability holistically, given that there are multiple dimensions of social, environmental, economic dimensions and their competing priorities. So I would say that the friction is more between the various dimensions of sustainability, say economic growth versus environmental sustainability versus social impact. And this is where I think the nexus between energy, economic growth, food and water security, biodiversity, inequality, multiple factors playing. So, for example, how do we achieve our ambitious clean energy goals without it leading to a disproportionate impact on our coal communities? Or how do we transition to EVs without negatively impacting our automobile value chains? What do we prioritize when it comes to land, right? Because it's a finite resource, whether it's agriculture or the land that we need to establish these large-scale solar and wind installations or growing urbanization, right? How do we ensure that GDP and employment are not impacted as we pursue our low carbon pathways? In the multiple pathways and forecasts that we have attempted in the past, seems very difficult to be able to maintain GDP growth and not lose jobs. So all of this needs to be balanced essentially. Also, how do we ensure that manufacturing keeps pace with our technology ambitions? The growth in solar so far has hinged a lot on exports. So how do we ensure that's not the story for every technology? So these are historical learnings, and it doesn't mean what we did was wrong, but it was necessary at that moment in time because science demands transformation. But how do we do it in ways that will sustain in the long term is a challenge.
Anish, let me go across to you. In today's global economic landscape, what are the growth hotspots?
Most of the growth hotspots are what we call east of Suez, essentially the emerging Asia, Middle East, going into Far East. These are the places where the demographics are such that you will have natural growth. And we have also seen in most of these places very stable political regimes, which makes it a good combination to have growth at a large scale. The other part which is there is Africa, and unfortunately, Africa has disappointed for a very long time because of various geopolitical issues, governance issues, historical challenges which have to be dealt with. But we are seeing green shoots. So eventually, south of Suez is also something which we are going to see growth. In many other parts of the world, you will see degrowth actually, not growth, but these are the growth hotspots.
Apurva, if you could tell us and take us through, we all know about the environmental consequences, but what exactly is at stake here when we talk about environmental consequences? But just break those down for us, please.
I think just to start with, I'd say that in a bid to grow our economies at a certain pace or meet our targets on ambitious timelines, we often forget that there are trade-offs that could be equally significant. So for example, if you talk about the air pollution issue we face today in Delhi, that has a temporal dimension, going all the way back to the Green Revolution. At that time we were trying to solve the food problem at a certain pace. We didn't realize that would lead to a water problem, and the strategy to combat that water problem would in turn lead to crop burning that poses an equal if not bigger issue in terms of air pollution and health impacts on our cities. So the effects that we see today are because of a problem we were trying to solve several decades back. And that's how complex and interdependent our systems are, whether it's our natural ecosystems, the energy resources we are dependent on, or even human health. These are all so inextricably linked that we can't afford to ignore the consequences on these allied systems. And consequences could be of various kinds. For example, biodiversity being impacted by infrastructural development, or water pollution caused due to improper disposal of waste, or fertilizer runoff from agriculture, or forest land diversion caused due to our growing food and economy and energy needs that we're trying to fulfill, or even the geopolitical ramifications that arise from our dependence on certain minerals that are concentrated in specific countries. And with our growing dependence on these minerals, mining in these developing countries sometimes has huge social and environmental consequences as well. So it's complicated, and I think, of course, easier to say and harder to do, but we have to be able to find that balance.
Right. Anish, let me go across to you. What are the prevailing trends that we see in decarbonizing the global economy? And would it be possible for you to share some actionable strategies that are gaining traction?
Right. So the biggest lever that we are seeing currently is renewables. Now, last year in 2022, the investments in clean energy technologies exceeded all the investments in traditional fossil fuels, and most of that was renewables. So, in the immediate term, we are seeing renewables. But as we go forward, I think there will be more to be done because renewables itself will not deliver. Energy efficiency is something which has been happening silently. There will be a need to scale up energy efficiency much, much more deliberately because it's not so organized like the renewable energy sector, right? So, as a consequence, it's all disparate actions. And that is something which needs to be kind of pulled together through frameworks and made to happen. The third thing is on lower materials use. Because we are talking about, as Apurva mentioned, we are talking of many minerals which are short in supply. There are challenges. So we have to look at lesser use of minerals, which means better designs, alternate designs, where there is, issues are lesser, and so on and so forth. And finally, I think it is the energy problem is also linked to the food and health problem. In fact, this is one of my recent realizations that unless we solve some of those things, we are not going to solve the energy problem. For example, meat, be it a cattle rearing or poultry, it takes a lot more energy, and particularly it takes water, and as a consequence takes a lot more energy, and that's been growing in the recent past. So our habits have to change. What Prime Minister Modi has called lifestyle for environment, I think that's a fair call out. We need to pursue that much more strongly, and possibly if we do that, then we'll also have a healthier planet because the planet today is quite unhealthy.
Yeah, it's like going back to the basics, how it all started, and that's exactly what we are being told. And it's amazing how much India has to offer to the world when it comes to sustainable lifestyle. Apurva, coming to you, for those looking at contributing to a greener world, what are the practical options that are available in participating in the global decarbonization effort?
So I think Anish covered a lot of these options in his response, so I won't repeat that. But I would broadly sort of divide these options within the buckets of reducing, substituting, and compensating. Right. So reducing could be what Anish talked about in terms of energy or material efficiency or circularity. Within substitution, it could be to replace fuels with cleaner forms of energy, or electrify your systems so that it's easier for you to do that. And then compensation could happen through the form of offsets or forestry, or even say carbon capture, utilization and storage, or other removal technologies which are fairly still fairly nascent. But when one talks about contributing to global decarbonization efforts, it's important to understand not just the options that you have available, but how fast these options need to be deployed, and what scale they need to be deployed at, to be able to credibly claim that you're aligned with global decarbonization efforts or global ambition. But how does one sort of translate this overarching goal, like a 2-degree or a 1.5-degree goal, to what it means for an individual company? And this is where frameworks like the Science Based Initiative come in. They help you understand what is the level of ambition that is needed at a corporate level to be able to align to science. And today, more than 200 companies in India have committed to SBTi targets or set targets in conformance with the frameworks. But once also, if once you've set your targets, however, how do you achieve the decision making to meet these targets? How do you internalize decarbonization within an organization's decision making? And one of the ways to do that is to be able to adopt something called an internal carbon price. And a lot of companies are today doing that and using that to make procurement decisions. Not a lot of these companies are setting the price high enough at the moment such that it sort of incentivizes green over the brown sectors to the extent that is needed. But it is a step in the right direction, because the larger challenge they're grappling with is the fact that there is an absence of a greenium or a green premium in many of these critical sectors.
Anish, going across to you, with the rising demand for resources, particularly in the context of a low carbon energy transition, how can we ensure the resilience and sustainability of supply chains?
So again, it's a big issue, and just like many of those intractable issues, they need to be taken squarely. See, the problem is also, one is the resources availability, and the second is the concentration of those of power, and in certain countries, and particularly we are talking of China. So, in case of solar, we are aware that China has kind of taken a massive leap in the past. Even it did for wind also, but solar was a big highlighted, heralded story. It's the same thing for battery, where China controls the whole value chain of minerals and also the processing power. 85% of the processing power for processing of battery is in China, and that is untenable because that cannot work. So that's where countries like India have to scale up. We are already seeing action. So we are seeing, for example, action on solar. The government has taken bitten the bullet and is creating, incentivizing creation of large amount of solar capacity. We also have to look at whether we can do the same thing for batteries, or if that is not available for lithium ion kind of thing, alternate chemistries, whether within lithium or outside, or alternates like pump storage, which can actually be a very credible alternative. So we need to have a strategy which kind of addresses the core of the issue. The work has started on that.
Apurva, what steps can industries take to meet the growing demand for resources while maintaining sustainable and resilient supply chains?
Right. I think the basic fact that we have to to be able to internalize is the fact that the world is changing, and it needs to change. So we need to be, as corporates, also we need to be agile, and we can't continue to grow at the way that we used to grow and do what we used to do. So what we can try and do is anticipate what that change is going to be and accommodate it even before it happens. But at the same time, we all know that none of us can accurately or even semi-accurately predict the future. I used to be a modeler, and I've never met two modelers who have predicted the future the exact same way. And I've never even seen them agree to each other's constructs enough to sort of modify their own. And none of them are technically right or wrong until it actually happens. So the point is that one has to be ready for what you can't predict, or the disruptions and the shocks that we may not even anticipate. And for that, we need to have what is an agile supply chain to begin with. For example, ensuring that your supply chain is diversified enough where possible could be one way to do that, or that we have carried out enough due diligence to start with, to ensure that our partners and vendors that we work with broadly align to the sustainability vision that the company holds today, or that they will continue to do so in the future. Because the most challenging part is you don't get to exercise a great deal of operational or financial control on what you don't own, and that's practically your entire supply chain. You don't have control over. The only thing you have control over are who your vendors are, right, or the choice of the vendor, but not much on what they do and how they do it. So it's important to ensure that you're making that choice well. Also, when it comes to supply chains, technologies can play a very key role in enabling sustainability, whether it's embracing traceability across the value chain, helping gather data, predicting potential disruptions, whether it's climate-induced or otherwise, enabling precision in the use of resources. For example, if you're an organization that procures agricultural commodities, it can help you understand at the farm level what the right set of inputs are, so you're not overusing these inputs. Typically, because that's where a lot of the emissions happen. Or if you're, for example, a heavy industry, it can help you. Tech can help you optimize your utilities and your facilities with the help of AI. So I would say that these are some of the important points to keep in mind.
Anish, how are industries actively contributing to decarbonization efforts? And can you also provide us with some real world examples of their impact?
So, as I said, there is a big thing on emphasis on renewables, and I think that is something which is becoming, norm, so to speak. And that's where you have corporate PPAs coming in, where people source renewables through the grid from their own sources rather than buying brown power from the utilities. So I think that is a movement which is a genuine movement which has picked up quite strongly. I would also say, as I mentioned, that energy efficiency has been under the radar. There's been some good developments which have happened in energy efficiency. There's a need for scaling them up, but there is already positive movement there. Finally, if you go to the user industries like steel, we are talking of green steel, which could be through various means, including through hydrogen eventually. But as of now, these are difficult. We call them hard to abate sectors. These are difficult, but eventually we'll get there. It requires a lot of investments and effort, and will. The last I would want to call out is sustainable aviation fuels. Aviation is actually consuming a massive amount of energy, and these are all currently from hydrocarbons. So there's an alternative in the form of sustainable aviation fuels, which we need to pursue.
Apurva, let me go across to you. For businesses and industries looking to play their part in reducing carbon emissions, what practical actions, on ground can they take to make a difference?
Yeah, I think we covered a lot of this already in one of the questions, and now with what Anish said. But I would say that the buckets of reduce, substitute, compensate hold true whether it's industry or economy or an individual, right? Industries are taking a range of measures, like Anish pointed out, that transition to clean energy. That's an important one. But I have to say, and just to complement what Anish said, is that it's easier for some industries versus others when it comes to clean energy, because electricity only contributes to less than one fourth of the total demand of industry. Total sort of emission contribution of industry. The rest actually comes from process heat, and that's the majority contributor. It's a very common misconception that electricity is, but it's actually heat. And at the moment, electric-driven heating options have limited applications. There's no commercially viable substitute for fossil fuels when it comes to heating. We still have to wait for green hydrogen, like Anish said, to come to parity before we can deeply decarbonize some of these sectors within industry. In the near term, like Anish pointed out, technologies that enhance efficiency or drive that incremental change may be the best bet. Also, if you look at emissions, logistics and transportation are major contributors within industry. And while electric vehicles are an option for employees or company vehicles, essentially four-wheelers, but when it comes to heavy-duty logistics, there's no commercially viable option at the moment, whether it's heavy-duty road freight or maritime or aviation. Although I would say that a lot of very promising developments are taking place all over the world, and in the future, when these options become commercially available, they'll start to pick up. Whether it's, for example, fuel cells or biofuels, or like Anish mentioned, sustainable aviation fuels.
Let me go across to green hydrogen now. Now, green hydrogen is generating a lot of buzz. Anish, when do you think is the right time for widespread adoption, and what role does technology play in this shift?
Right. So green hydrogen was touted as an over-the-horizon technology just 2, 3 years ago, and suddenly it's all caught imagination as of now. So it's going through a classic hype cycle which you have in technology. It's the same thing which is playing out in green hydrogen. So there will be a lot of initial interest. There are pilots which are getting done. There will be the disappointment of the after the hype, and then it'll come back eventually to kind of become a mainstay player. As of now, we are at the height of the hype cycle, so to speak. The challenges are that the costs of green hydrogen is not comparable to gray hydrogen, and as of now we don't have pathways to a sharp reduction of those costs, because 70% of the costs of green hydrogen is renewable electricity. And if you have to have reduction in that, then only the green hydrogen costs can come down. As of now we don't have a pathway to that, a sharp reduction on renewable energy costs. But then technologies, there's a lot of initiative effort going in, so technologies change. I'm sure it'll it'll come back.
We had an event in Delhi where Mr. Nitin Gadkari had come, and he controller organized Policy Next, where he came in a hydrogen powered car. This was earlier this year, which I thought was quite an interesting choice. He made quite an entry. Apurba, just to understand the significance of technologies like green hydrogen in the context of transitioning to a low carbon economy, and the timing considerations involved in this.
Sure. I think the short answer here is that it's quite significant in the medium to long term, because when it comes to industry, and specifically the hard to abate set of industries like Anish mentioned, like cement, steel, fertilizer, petrochemicals, while energy and material efficiency may be the short term bets here, the real step jumps will happen with green hydrogen adoption, CCUS implementation, or greater electrification. So these are the three main pillars. But aside from industry as well, if you look at, like I said, heavy duty transport and logistics, or shipping, aviation, trucks or buses, again, green hydrogen could be a game changer. And not just in its pure form, but in terms of its derivatives like ammonia or through fuel cells. Because it's not meant for every transport application, because there are huge conversion losses across its value chain in hydrogen. But it could potentially serve a lot of the heavy duty segments quite well, given that current technologies like batteries are not very viable options there. It could also serve as a great seasonal storage medium, which batteries are not. So they can build in that kind of flexibility into the grid as well. And then there could be domestic applications, for example, through cooking fuel, because when one is looking at a net zero transition, one has to consider alternates for every emission source, no matter how significant that is. And that is a bigger challenge.
Anish, let me go across to you. In the realm of carbon removal, how can industries and government effectively collaborate? And what positive outcomes can arise from such collaborations?
Right. So this is my personal view. It's not been called out very sharply, but I do believe that there's basis for what I'm preferring. So, the industries will reduce carbon through various means, offsets, CCUS, and so on and so forth. But the historical stock of emissions, I don't think industries will take the responsibility. I believe that that is something governments have to do, and there has to be some framework, global framework, maybe even a treaty to make that happen. Not going to be easy, but if this is an existential crisis we are facing, then governments have to step up. Where industries can come in is to implement those projects. So because these will finally mean large scale projects. It could be CCUS, it could be carbon removal and various direct air capture, nature based solutions, and so on and so forth. I think for the stock of carbon, we will need governments to step in and industries to implement.
Okay, Apurba, could you share some insights into successful collaborations between industry and governments in addressing carbon removal challenges and achieving environmental goals?
I think to start with, I just want to mention like a basic difference between removal and carbon capture, right? I think a lot of people use it very interchangeably. But carbon capture is when you capture the carbon that would, in the business as usual scenario, go into the atmosphere, and then you store or you reuse it. Carbon removal is about removing what is already there in the atmosphere, and that's where we talk about technologies like direct air capture or bioenergy with capture, carbon capture and storage, or even forestry for that matter. But in both the cases, if you have to talk about examples, whether it's CCUS or whether it's direct air capture, they're all from other countries at the moment, because while a lot of the clients that we speak to here are exploring CCUS in India, there aren't many cases of implementation that come to light. And frankly, that makes sense from the industry standpoint, because CCUS or carbon removal will only make commercially favorable if there's a commercial means of using that captured carbon, which justifies that investment, which at the moment there are limited applications. Perhaps as biofuels or sustainable aviation fuel demands increase, and we've seen that shoot up in the recent past. And once that conversion technology is in place, I feel that a lot of this might pick up on the CCS side. But basically on the removal side, direct air capture is still very nascent, super expensive. because the cost of capturing that carbon depends on the concentration of carbon dioxide in the air, which is barely like 0.4%. But there are small scale direct capture, air capture plants globally at the moment. But that removal capacity on an aggregate is really quite low. But many countries are encouraging CCUS in a big way. For example, the Biden administration has provided incentives for CCUS under the Inflation Reduction Act. Many governments have provided funding as well to jumpstart the industry. China has made progress with one of the largest CCS plants. So there are positive developments that are happening at this front, but it's taking its time.
Okay, let's go across to Anish on this. Anish, carbon pricing and carbon markets are gaining a lot of attention. And how might these frameworks facilitate the transition to a low carbon economy? And what are the challenges that you see in economies actually transitioning to a low carbon economy?
So, in terms of markets, markets are, you have to understand conceptually what roles markets play. It is a transaction platform which mediates and brings the producer and the seller and then the buyer together, so to speak, for their own distinct needs. And markets have worked quite well in various places. Uh, Carbon markets in general have had a boom bust cycle in the past, and there is also a little bit of a lack of confidence in the market. So there is a lot of effort which needs to go into the carbon markets. But having said that, I think that is one of the key ingredients for making this happen. So decarbonization happen. And as I said, there is a general apathy to price carbon high at the real value of carbon because it does upset the economics. But finally, we don't have a choice. We have to get there. So the earlier we get into the structured carbon markets, the better it is. India is starting its carbon markets. It will go through its own learning journeys, but very essential.
Okay, my final question to you, Apurba. What role do carbon pricing and carbon markets play in driving the shift towards a low carbon economy, and what potential hurdles should we be prepared for while implementing these frameworks?
Sure. See, today, as per OECD reports, some form of carbon pricing now covers more than 40% of global emissions. So it's countries across the world that are implementing pricing frameworks, and in multiple different ways. Either implicitly or explicitly through direct carbon taxes or subsidies, or by say these emission trading mechanisms. Like Anish mentioned, that India is also coming up with its own carbon market mechanism. So they've all proven to be cost-effective ways of decarbonizing an economy. But the bigger challenge is typically to be able to design these systems in a way that they adequately incentivize green. And that's a bigger challenge. And that's where we've seen a lot of these trading systems usually fail in their first attempts, because it's very important to set those caps and thresholds carefully because they can make or break a market. Whether it was the first phase of the European Union emission trading scheme, or whether it was the Kyoto Protocol, or for that matter, the Perform Achieve and Trade scheme in India. The trading in the first phase was limited because there was an oversupply of credits. So for an effective market to develop, or for an effective carbon price to be realized at an economy through market measures, it's important to assess that demand and supply well. Also important to understand that while we have mitigation ambition, we need to analyze the trade-offs in terms of the cost industry will have to bear, in terms of what is practically possible. So it should not impose an undue burden on industry that makes them less competitive. Or otherwise, one has to introduce countermeasures like the EU did in terms of the carbon border adjustment mechanism. Right. My third point would be that, and specifically from the India context, I would say that, at the moment we have a national carbon market being developed. We have existing schemes like Perform Achieve and Trade scheme or the REC scheme, which may be subsumed within that. But we also have the voluntary carbon markets existing at the same time. And we have the whole conversation on Article 6.2 and 6.4 ongoing within international negotiations. On top of that, we have the voluntary green carbon, green credit mechanism as well. So while the intent is well, and each of these has a slightly different objective, it can get quite confusing for industry. Even practitioners like us who have been working on carbon markets for a decade and a half, we have doubts as to how the technical aspects such as additionality or regulation will play in. So I think while it's complicated at present, I think it's important to demystify or make it simpler for industry to be able to participate effectively.
All right. Thank you so much for that in-depth analysis into what will it really take for India and the world to grow sustainably. Thank you very much, Anish, and thank you very much, Apurba. We, of course, will keep tracking the India growth story here at Network 18. Thanks so much for watching.
KPMG presents The Blueprint, Business in the New Normal.